One of the things that began to be clear to me in my work at the university and my work in the church is that I seem to find myself at the juncture or the hinge points of certain conflicts. And so this was during the 60s when the civil rights movement was very much in flow, where the war in Vietnam was becoming an increasingly divisive war. And I found myself leaning in direction of challenging certain actions, certain government programs, certain issues that seemed to me to be really critical. And so I was very interested in trying to find ways to help bring attention, because some of my students, this was a time when my students were being drafted. Some of them were becoming conscientious objectors. There was a great deal of turmoil on campus over the civil rights movement and over the war in Vietnam. And I was very much conflicted about that, because coming out of a more conservative religious and social situation, I felt somehow in the beginning defensive of the war in Vietnam, but I became increasingly convinced that it was a misbegotten war, and that the way we were fighting it was immoral. So I began to write about that. I began to publish articles in Dialogue about it. I began to participate in certain demonstrations on campus. And I remember teaching gospel doctrine class in church at this time. And as part of that, I decided to do a slide presentation put together by the Quakers on what was happening with the bombing that we were doing in Vietnam, and the mines that we were placing there. And I can remember showing this slide presentation and getting quite a strong reaction from members of my Sunday school class, who felt that somehow I was not being patriotic. That was an example of the kinds of tension points that I have found myself in with regard to my church and my fellow believers at times. I can remember teaching another gospel doctrine class during this time on blacks in the priesthood. I had, as editor of Dialogue, I had published an article by Lester Bush Jr. called Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, which was the most comprehensive and most responsible piece of scholarship that had been published on the subject. In fact, I can remember clearly, as if it were today, my feeling in reading Lester's article. I just felt, for the first time, someone has laid out the whole story of how Latter-day Saints saw blacks, and how the teaching of denying the priesthood to them had come to be. I'd actually been troubled by this much earlier when I was a young missionary in the northern states. I remember knocking on doors that, of course, you knock on a door, you know who's going to be on the other side. Knocking on doors, and the door would open, there would be a black person there, and we would go in and teach them, but we were instructed when we did that not to go back. So I felt then, as a 19 and 20-year-old, really conflicted about that, because these people seemed to me to be spiritual and very interested in my message, but then I was not given permission to continue to teach them. And I also remember that we had a young missionary who came out from Cedar City, I believe it was, and his family had moved there from the South, and there had been a rumor that they had Negro blood or black blood in their family history. And so this young man was not able to hold the priesthood or go on a mission, and finally appealed his case to President David O. McKay, who overruled the local authorities and said he should be able to go. And I remember that young man coming into our mission. But with the civil rights movement in full force at this time, with the war in Vietnam, there were many of these issues of social import and also of spiritual and religious import really became important to me. I can remember we belonged to a study group of Latter-day Saints, and we were studying different things, different political and social subjects going on in the world. And the section on Vietnam was one that Ruth and I were scheduled to teach. And I remember after the response to our teaching this lesson, guiding this discussion, that there was a tremendous amount of hostility. Our being against the war caused our fellow believers to be that we were anti-American and that we in fact were disloyal to the church or to the gospel, and yet we felt that this was an expression of our highest loyalty to be opposed to something that we felt was morally unjustified. So there were a number, and on campus this was happening as well. There was a lot of racial tension on campus, some conflict between various groups of black students, and some students were killed on campus in this kind of racial tension between black groups. But there was also a lot of tension between blacks and whites, and I can remember trying to do something. I wanted to do something constructive, and so I organized a series of lectures by the faculty called Points of View on the Current Crisis or something like that, and invited faculty members to participate in that. And I also was trying, I remember meeting with the students from the Black Student Union, and I went into the meeting to talk to them about how we could work together, and not a single person would shake my hand. And so that was an indication of this tension. And later the Watts riots erupted, the Cambodia Kent, the killings at Kent University. There was just a tremendous amount of tension. And again, as I had students who were being drafted or subject to the draft and going through that, and as I was in my teaching, I taught, one of the courses that I taught was the American short story, and in that I used a short story by Shirley Jackson called The Lottery. And it's a very powerful story, but I used it deliberately because it seemed to me that it was teaching essentially what was going on through a more metaphorical way of going on with my students who were subject to the draft. So I was also continuing at this time to be involved with educational programs at UCLA. I read an article in the New York Times that that talked about the large number of Americans who were functionally illiterate and illiterate, and so I decided I would do something about that. So I created a program called the Adult Literacy Program, which was basically to say to any adult living in Los Angeles County, if you feel insecure about your reading and your writing and your ability to figure, come to this course and we'll try and help you. And I can remember going, it was a weekend course, and at the break, I remember standing around, and I saw a black man standing by himself. And so I went on to introduce myself to him and asked him about where he was from. And he said he was from Compton and that he had gotten up early that morning. He had taken 3 or 4 different buses in order to get to UCLA. And he said, this is the first time I've ever been on a university campus. But I've come because I want to learn how to read. And I was deeply touched by that, but also excited that the university could reach out into the community. The university could break down those traditional barriers, because in some ways a university, especially a university like UCLA, is a kind of a fortress, and many people feel that they don't have access to that fortress. And there were certainly people on the faculty who reinforced that idea of it being a fortress or an elite place. But I wanted to break down those walls. I wanted there not to be a barrier between the opportunity to learn and the people who wanted to learn, because in a sense that told my own story, because I felt that I wasn't educated as a college student, that I wasn't smart, that I wasn't capable of learning. And so the transformation that happened that brought me to that place was something that I wanted to share. And again, it was something that I couldn't have done if I had stayed on the English faculty, because I simply, that was much too confining in terms of what I hoped to do in terms of the vision I had for education. So it was a great place for me to be, and turned out to be a place that was fun, that was interesting, and that in many ways was extremely vital.